This is your tutorial for writing comparison and contrast essays. In order to do this tutorial, we're going to use the following prompt. Comparison and contrast essay. Compare and contrast the political, economic, and social ideologies of the Federalist and the Jeffersonian Republicans following the Constitutional Convention. So your thesis statement, very similar to the other types of thesis statements that we've been talking about, you're going to have 2 to 3 sentences to operate in. You must do the following. First, you've got to address all parts of the prompt. I know, again, this sounds like the duh comment, but believe it or not, a lot of students don't do this. They'll either do the comparison part or they'll do the contrast part. They leave out certain elements that are being asked in this particular question. In this particular question, you're asked to compare and contrast Federalists and Democratic Republicans on 3 different levels. So it's really important that you address all parts of the prompt. You use 2 to 3 sentences and always make sure that you have a specific warrant or reason in doing so. The reason why I say that is this: a lot of times people will just kind of throw out a blanket opinion statement. You always want to have a because statement. The because statement does not have to be explicit, it can be implicit, but there does need to be a reason behind the argument that you're giving. One sentence of the thesis statement should be a direct contrast. Make sure you include both Federalists and Democratic Republicans. You don't have to use all 3 levels that they're asking for in every single sentence, but you do need to make sure that you impact back to one of those major 3 issues that was brought up in the question. Second sentence should be a direct comparison. Again, make sure you state Federalists, state Democratic Republicans, state what you're comparing them on, be specific. And then last up, state a statement of significance. Tell us why this is really important. So let's take a look at a few examples. Here's a poor example. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans were similar because they held common American values. They differed on how the new republic should run the economy. Now, why is this a problem? Well, there are a couple of problems here. First off, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, both are being mentioned, so that's really good. However, it states here held common American values. That's referring to something that's kind of vague, so I'm not quite sure what this sentence is trying to accomplish. Also, they differed on how the new republic should run the economy. Well, it's telling me that there is some reason as to why they differed, but it's not really being very specific. And notice here there's no statement of significance. So here's a good example. The Federalists and Democratic Republicans were similar in believing the need to escape the British parliamentary model by establishing a system of limited government under checks and balances. But they differed on whether the elite or the common farmer should run an economy based upon an industry or agriculture. And this established the differing traditions of limited government. Now notice here there are multiple things that are really good about this thesis statement. Both Federalists and Democratic Republicans are stated. There is a very specific political reason why they're similar, in that they got rid of the British parliamentary model and went with the checks and balances model. They differed on who should run the leadership, and they also differed on traditions of limited government based upon economic models. So notice here this is very specific, gives me specific reasons, and not just refers to areas that you're going to talk about in the essay. Your body paragraphs. So each body paragraph should start off with a topic sentence that states either a direct comparison or a direct contrast statement. Make sure you use the rule of 3, meaning you should give specific examples from historical context, and you want to use 3 of them in each body paragraph. Now again, like I've said before, the rule of 3 is not really a rule, it's a guideline. It's important that you try to hit 3 specific examples. What if you can't get to 3 specific examples in every body paragraph? That's okay, but what you want to try and do is try to offer 3 in as many paragraphs as possible. By doing that, you're going to go way over the amount that's being expected of you inside of an essay. Then you're going to wrap up your body paragraph with a conclusion statement. And that's going to be an analysis for why there's a similarity or why there's a difference. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's a poor example. Democratic Republicans were similar in that they believed in a limited government. Now notice here a few problems with this topic sentence. First off, we only have Democratic Republicans, no mentions of the Federalists. Another problem here is that it's really general. All it tells me is that the Democratic Republicans believe in limited government, but how is that different from Federalists? Federalists also believe in limited government, but with a different definition of what they meant by limited government. So here's a much better example. Democratic Republicans were similar to the Federalist faction in rejecting the British model of the Parliament for a system of checks and balances. So notice here that we have a much more specific definition of what we mean by limited government that both Democratic Republicans and Federalists would have agreed to. They had differing beliefs about who should lead this limited government, but at least on this notion of rejecting the Parliament and going with checks and balances, both of these factions did agree on this issue. Analysis. Now, at the bottom of every body paragraph, you're going to provide a reason why there's a comparison or a contrast that exists. Make sure that the analysis is about the reason for the comparison or contrast. A lot of people get this mixed up, and they think that this has to do with significance or overall effects. It's not. It's about the reason for the comparison or for the contrast. So make sure you have a specific reason or warrant for that analysis. Here are some examples. For example, Federalists believed in the elite guiding the economy because they favored the education of the natural elite. Notice here the problem with this example. It's a reason for why the Federalists believed in what they believed in. It's not a reason for the comparison or the contrast between Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Here's a good example of what I'm looking for. Federalists and Democratic Republicans differed on who should govern because they represented the different industrial and agricultural classes. Now notice here, this is about contrast. We have both groups, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, and we're given a specific reason why they had a difference. In the Federalist case, they represented industrial groups. In the Democratic Republicans case, they favored agricultural classes. So we're given a specific reason why they had a difference in their governing style. The difference has to come with who they were representing. So this is what I'm looking for when you're giving an analysis of contrast or comparison. You want to give the reason for why there's a contrast, why there's a comparison, not a reason for why one group believed or did one thing or the other group believed it. You want to have a reason for the contrast or comparison. Synthesis. So the very last thing you want to do, like in your other essays, is to have a last paragraph that's based upon synthesis. You're going to make a connection to another time period. Make sure that connection is direct to the other period. So don't just give a general connection to another time period. Make sure it's direct to what you've been talking about inside of the essay. Here's some examples. For example, the fight between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans is very similar to the differences between Republicans and Democrats in the early 1900s. Early progressives fought over similar issues, but in a different context. And this can be seen in their approaches to foreign policy issues. Okay, notice all the different problems here in this particular synthesis. First off, the one good thing that this does do is that it draws a connection between two other types of political parties or political factions much later on within American history. So just as we have Federalists and Democratic Republicans, now we have Republicans and Democrats in the progressive age. That part is fine. The problem is that we're given this very broad and general connection that doesn't really tell us what the specific comparison is being made. All it said is that there's this different context in which there were similar types of issues, but this is reference. There's nothing here that can directly tie this together. And in fact, it ends trying to make a broad connection to foreign policy issues, except the problem is there's nothing in the question that asked about foreign policy issues. It's all about domestic issues on governance and economics and ideology. So in this particular case, the synthesis is there, but it's just referring, and it's referring to the wrong area. Here's a good example. Federalists and Democratic Republicans were similar to the fight between Teddy Roosevelt's belief in a strong federal government and Woodrow Wilson's promotion of a small competitive businesses. Just like the Federalists and Democratic Republicans differed on the natural leadership of the elite, progressives argued about whether power should be centralized or decentralized to local areas. So notice here, this is really specific in the comparison. We have two factions, Federalists and Democratic Republicans, two political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans' similarities to the progressive age in the way that Republicans and Democrats dealt with things. We also have very specific comparison between Teddy Roosevelt and his management system, very similar to that of Alexander Hamilton, Woodrow Wilson's type of management system, which are very similar to Thomas Jefferson's notion of small businesses. So notice here, very specific connection, very specific similarities that are being drawn out between these two groups over time period. So, some rules to consider when you're doing a comparison-contrast essay. First off, always make sure you have two comparisons and two contrasts. Now, that's not within the thesis, it's within the body paragraphs. So by the time you're done, you should have a thesis, you should have 4 body paragraphs, 2 comparison, 2 contrast, and a concluding paragraph based on synthesis. All examples need to provide a significance that connects back to the thesis. Don't just make broad comparisons and contrasts. They have to connect back to the thesis, otherwise they're irrelevant. Make sure it's not what we call parallel contrast or comparisons. This is where you would talk about, let's say, the Democratic Republicans in one paragraph and the Federalists in a second paragraph. That's known as a parallel contrast or parallel comparison, in which you are talking about both groups, but they're in separate paragraphs, and you're expecting the reader to make the connection of the contrast or comparisons. Contrast and comparisons have to be direct, and they have to be in the same paragraph. So, your overall structure of the essay, what should it look like? Because I know there's a lot of information I've thrown at you. Start off with a thesis, 2 to 3 sentences. This should be your introductory paragraph. Make sure it looks like an introductory paragraph, but it shouldn't really go beyond 2 to 3 sentences. Keep it at the thesis. After that, you're going to provide two comparison paragraphs, 2 contrast paragraphs. Now, it's up to you as to how you want to order that. You could have 2 comparison, 2 contrast. You could have comparison, contrast, comparison, contrast, contrast, comparison, contrast, comparison. It really doesn't matter. What's important is that you have 2 comparison paragraphs, 2 contrast paragraphs that are clearly ordered with clear transitions. Make sure there's a topic sentence that's either direct comparison, direct contrast, have a rule of 3, and finish with an analysis statement on why there's a comparison or why there's a contrast. And then your last paragraph, your concluding paragraph, should be a synthesis paragraph that connects to another time period using all the guidelines that we talked about.